Looks good? All right. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Salatu wassalam ala nabiyyina Muhammad wa ala alihi wa ashabihi ajma'in amma ba'd. Last week we began speaking about the fragmentation of the Abbasid era, the Abbasid Caliphate, and how the Muslim Ummah started falling apart politically speaking. And we spoke about one of the fragmentations, that was the Fatimids. The Fatimids were the Ismaili political entity, and we spoke about them a little bit. And another fragmentation was actually the Buyids. The Buyids took over the capital, so Iraq, Khurasan, Iran, that area, and a little bit north of that. So Iran entering into Pakistan, Afghanistan, these areas, this is where the Buyids took over. Now the Buyids were coming from the outskirts of the Islamic world, mainly Central Asia. So they came from Central Asia and started coming in. And this is something interesting in our history. You find that a lot of, I want to say problems, but a lot of revolts or political change tends to come from people who are living in the outskirts of the Muslim world. And it's really interesting because Ibn Khaldun has a theory on this. And that's his theory of political power, and that a political regime lasts around 3-4 generations. Generation being around 30 years. So a political entity will last 90 to 120 years. And that is because the first generation who revolts or expels a previous political regime, right? What happens is they were living a hard lifestyle, right? In the outskirts, desert life. And that type of lifestyle does two things for a people. Number one, it makes them really strong physically. Physically, mentally, they're strong. They're not distracted by worldly pleasures. Their mindset, they have a vision, they have a goal. And the other thing is that in order to survive in these environments, you need a group feeling, a asaba. So what happens is these people realize that part of their survival is actually being good to one another, protecting one another. And this is what kept the Arabs of Arabia pre-Islam alive. Such a harsh environment. And most of us here have probably been to Mecca. But if you ever leave that region, or maybe on the way between Mecca and Medina, you've seen the terrain. And people are living in this. There's very little water. And it's extremely hot. The environment is harsh. So what helped them survive is the tribal feeling that we are a tribe, we need to stick together and sacrifice everything for one another. And the Prophet ﷺ praises the tribe of Al-Ghafari, in which what would happen if they were economically doing bad, there was a drought or they didn't have enough provisions to sustain themselves, what they would do is as a tribe, they'd all come together, bring everything that they have and put it together and then share it. So the Prophet ﷺ praised them for that and says that this is something that brings barakah. So you have these groups coming out from the outskirts and then they set their eyes on a greater goal and they start entering the civilizations. And they oust the previous regime and they take over. Now this first generation is strong. They build their society, they protect their society. The second generation still has that asaba feeling, the group feeling, but it's a little bit weaker. Right? And they continue the vision of their predecessors and they continue to expand. And by the time they take over, really the economy expands a lot, the society expands, it builds. So by the time the third generation comes, they're spoiled. They're more focused on worldly pleasures, worldly goods, they're comfortable, they lose that strength, the inner spirit, the strength, right, of living a harsher lifestyle. And by the time that third generation ends or the fourth generation comes, another group comes and takes over. So that's Ibn Khaldun's theory of the changing of political regimes. And it seems like perhaps some of that was going on in this time. So these individuals come from Central Asia, come and take over. And the Buyids were Twelver Shiites, right? And like the Fatimids, the Buyids weren't too concerned with a theological movement. they weren't theologically fueled. They were more concerned about the economy and the culture and civilization than the theological or having a theological vision. So like the Fatimids, they didn't force convert anyone, right? Muslims were living. They were tolerant to other Muslim sects. They were tolerant to other people. So what the Buyids did, though, is that they helped revive Persian culture. And now I'm not necessarily talking about pre-Islamic Persian, but Persian culture. Persia has a very rich history. So these guys coming from outside of civilization, they come here and they adopt a civilization, right? Because part of their success, especially when we get to the Mongols momentarily, you'll see kind of how that functioned with them. These people who are coming from the outskirts, they don't really have a civilization. They don't have a mindset. They don't have a vision, right? So they have to adopt something in order to continue to survive, or to become more absorbed in the greater culture, greater society. So they helped revive the symbols and practices of Persian pre-Islamic rulers. The Persian language, culture, and literature increased. So Imam al-Ghazali, during his time, he actually spoke Persian. I believe his mother language was Persian, and he knew Arabic as well. And he has books that were in Persian that were translated to Arabic, and he dealt with these leaders. Now, there were attempts of reviving Zoroastrianism, but it failed. Of course, by that time, religion, Islam, was still strong in the minds and hearts of people. The Buyids were 12er Shiites, and if you remember, 12er Shiites, they believe in 12 Imams, right? Ending with the Mahdi, who's they're waiting for. Right? They said that this Mahdi went into a cave, and they're waiting for him for about 1,200 years now. So that's where the 12er Shiites, it's the same ones who are currently in Iran today, the same theology. So they tolerated other Muslim sects. They kept the caliphate because it was something symbolic. So by this time, the Khalifa, had pretty much very little power. He was more like a pope figure, but even with less authority. He's just kind of symbol. This guy is the head of Islam, right? The head of the Muslims, the unity of Muslims. But in terms of political authority, he was pretty much nothing, a nobody. So they didn't sack the caliphate. They kept him for this purpose, right? For this purpose of symbolic unity. They were more concerned with economic interest over racial and religious affinities. I mentioned this last week, but I'll say it again because it is important to understand this, and that is when Baghdad was taken over, it started declining economically, and the fragmentation of the Ummah. What happened was, or one of the actually positive consequences of that, was that these other city centers began to be more interested in themselves, because now all the wealth isn't going to one area, Baghdad, rather the wealth is being distributed a little bit more equally between these cities. So Nishapur is able to build itself, Khorasan, Cairo in Egypt, Damascus, these other areas. And what you find is that during this time, scholarship really launches, and I'll get to that a little bit later today. Islam is increasingly seen as a religion of society rather than of the rulers primarily. So now that the caliphate is dying, or it's very weak, Islam is now seen through the scholars and not through the Khilafah. And the scholars, as I mentioned, are people of the people. They are people who are walking around with other people. You see them in the markets. You have access to them. You engage with them. You have dinner with them. Right? Anyone can go up to a scholar and say, hey, can I talk to you for a few minutes? So with the caliphate collapsing or becoming weaker and weaker, the eyes or looking at Islam becomes looking at society rather than a political entity. Linguistic barriers are increasingly overcome, and we also mentioned that during this time a lot of conversion was happening. And I mentioned that is because Muslims and non-Muslims now are speaking the same language. Culture is now unified a little bit more. So they're able to engage with one another, and people are seeing that, hey, Islam isn't just for some people, it's for all people. Hey, there's something interesting about this. I can engage this, I can be part of this. Okay, so you have the Fatimids, and then you have the Buyids, and now you have the Seljuks. And the Seljuks play a very important role during this time, and that is they revive Sunnism. And if you remember, last week we mentioned that this past century is what's called the Shiite century, because the Fatimids and the Buyids are both Shiite regimes. So the Seljuks now come in. The Seljuks are Turks, and they are Turks coming from Central Asia. So what's called Turkic, not Turkish, but Turkic. And these are the Central Asian regions, Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, these areas. So they already had themselves established, but they were non-Muslims, and there were rivalries between various Turkic regimes or tribes. So they saw, and another thing that was going on is that the Abbasid Caliphate was bringing slaves from this Turkic region, and the Turkic people, if you ever engage with them, there were two young students of knowledge when I was in Jordan from Kazakhstan, and their father is a businessman. He goes back and forth between Jordan and Kazakhstan. So he once invited me and my teacher, and we sat for dinner, and he's this big muscular guy, right? And he presented this plate of traditional food. It was good. Alhamdulillah, it was very light on the stomach. And the Arabs, I don't know how it is in the Desi community. Do you like the head of the lamb? Yeah. Okay. So the Arab world, they really like it, right? They love it. And I thought that they were the Arabs were the people who loved this the most. And it's not really part of other cultures, right? They'll eat the brain, the eyes, the tongue, everything. They like it, and it's seen as something. If you want to really be hospitable to someone, you present the head. That's Arab culture, right? So I thought Arabs, like, they were number one. It comes to the head of the lamb. And then this guy presents, and there's that head, and the tongue is out, right? I never ate any of that. I didn't. I guess my Americanism, right? And he says, look, he takes the head. He says, Arabs here, they don't know how to eat the head. I'm like, whoa, okay. He takes it. He rips the entire skin off, all of it. It's dead, right? It's cooked. He takes it all in one swipe like this, takes it out, and he flips the head over. He's like, look, there are two keys here. Right? Some people they struggle, they're trying to break it, and it becomes a big mess. He cracked one bone, another bone, pulled the entire thing out. And it was amazing, right? This guy is rough, Kazakhstan. And what's funny is when he was doing this, he's looking at his two kids. They were probably 10, 11 years old at the time. And he's like, look, these kids, they're sick. They're sick. You put them a small plate of food, they can't finish it. When I was their age, we used to eat an entire lamb. Each entire lamb, right? And I noticed that he had this tattoo with numbers over here. I'm like, what's that? He said when we were still under the Soviet Union, boxing was under law. It was it was against the law, so it was underground. And I got caught and I was arrested, and they put this here. These are the Turkic people, and even the Ottomans, who originally are from this area, they were very powerful militarily, and this is where they're getting it from. So the Seljuks were like that, and they play a major role, as we will see momentarily. So the Abbasids were bringing them in as slaves. Now, the Turkic people are not just physically strong; they're actually smart politically, as we saw with the probably the most successful era of the Muslim, not era, but the most successful dynasty of Islam or Khilafah is the Ottomans, the longest, and it was the most effective. So they would be taken as slaves, and the Abbasids would spend a lot of money training them as warriors, as bodyguards, etc. And these Turkic people, like, you know what? We can do more than just be slaves. They eventually got so much power and influence that they went from caliphate slaves to caliphate killers. That's how powerful they became. I don't like the Khalifa. Okay, we're just going to get rid of him and bring another one. So Zahir Baybars, you've heard of this individual, right? He was one of these, coming from this region, the Mamluks. And they do a lot of work to expel the Crusaders and the Mongols, as we'll get to, inshallah. So that's how they are entering the Muslim world. So they already had some exposure to Islam, and they end up adopting Islam, and the Seljuks adopt Sunni Islam. So they are the first to convert to Sunni Islam as whole tribes, and then raid the central lands. And then an added bonus, they become the protectors of Sunni Islam. Now remember, the scholars are very worried right now. In the west, you have the Fatimids, and in the east, you have the Buyids. Right? Imam Ghazali expresses this. He's very concerned about the caliphate and where things are going. So the Muslim majority start really appreciating the Seljuks and allying with them because of this bonus. Right? Now, the Seljuks weren't the most morally upright people. They did things that were Muslims will see as appalling. But what they did successfully, the Seljuks, was that they didn't enter the realm of religion. Remember when we spoke about Shafi'i and how I mentioned that eventually the scholars took a control of the religious realm and said, you politicians, you're out of this. Don't enter this area. The Seljuks actually appreciated that and honored it. So they said, okay, you scholars, you do the law, you do all that stuff, the government and whatnot, we'll just take care of the political affairs. So, there was an agreement there that, we need these individuals to protect us militarily, because there's a lot of harm going on. And they let the scholars do what they wanted to do in terms of the religion. So they didn't interfere with that. Another thing that, so they would replace the Buyid in Baghdad and whatnot, but what gave the Seljuks even more popularity among the masses is two battles that they won. The first battle is the Battle of Dandanakan in 1040 against the Ghaznavids. The Ghaznavids and the Buyids over in this area, right? They defeated them. So here you can see the battle of 1040, which opened all of this land here, including Baghdad. And then in 1071, they defeated the Byzantines over here, which opened all of this land, right? So remember that for the past, we're in the 11th century now, from the time the Abbasids took the caliphate in the 2nd century until now, so you're talking about several centuries, offensive jihad did not occur. It was pretty much dead in that regard. So the Seljuks revived that in a very important time. So they gained a lot of popularity. Muslims see, these guys are actually benefiting us, they're defending us, they're protecting us. Here are some paintings, renderings of, this is really interesting, the Seljuk emperors humiliating the Roman emperors. So this guy is a Seljuk, and this is a Roman emperor, right? And you can see this portrayal. I'm guessing this is from European paintings, because Muslims don't really paint like this. Okay, Nizam al-Mulk is seen as the architect of Sunni revival. What he does is one of his major accomplishments, if you want to call it that, is the introduction of madrasas. Right? So people coming from the more eastern part of the Muslim world, you know what madrasas are. Right? It's very much well established. It was started in the 1000s by Nizam al-Mulk. The establishment of Sunni madrasas, and we'll talk about these implications in a moment. Throughout the empire, he supported Ash'arism in Persia as a bulwark against Shi'ism and literalists. A policy of supporting moderate religious orthodoxy. Under him, there was a lot of military success and progression under this individual. Now we get to the Crusades. Now all of this is happening in the same time. All of this is happening in the same time. So it was a very chaotic world. And remember, we haven't been talking about the ideological frictions that's going on. During this time, it's not only politically chaotic, there's a lot of innovations being introduced into Islam. The philosophers and the Mu'tazilites are still there. You have other sects. So when you look at people who were writing in this time, there's a lot of books that are about refutation, refuting this ideal and that ideology, because this was their reality. There was a lot going on, subhanAllah. It seemed like the Mongols came and it caused that to just be all swept up. But we'll get to that in a moment. So now let's talk about the Crusades. The origins, the Crusades are coming from Western Europe. Now, what's interesting, today, Western Europe is the richer part of Europe, whereas Eastern Europe is the poorer part. The Western Europe doesn't really like Eastern Europe. Back then, during this time, it was the eastern part of Europe that was rich, whereas the West was very poor and very bad situation. In the Muslim world, Damascus, Cairo, Iraq, this is where the money was, right? Whereas Mecca, Medina, the Gulf of Arabia was poor. Now today, it's the exact opposite, right? So it's quite common that, subhanAllah, Allah keeps things in balance, that there are always richer lands and always to make up for poorer lands. And the Muslim Ummah, as the Prophet ﷺ asked Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, he asked Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala not to annihilate or destroy this Ummah through drought. So you find that there's always wealth in the Ummah. if a rich Muslim area falls apart, then know that it will be replaced with another land that will gain. So alhamdulillah, Allah subhanahu, by the blessing of the dua of the Prophet ﷺ, we will always be okay. There will always be a Muslim lands defending the Muslims and taking care of Islam. So there was border rivalry. So what sparked the Crusades? There are many factors. Some are mentioned here, but not all of them. There was a rivalry between the Byzantines and the Seljuks, right? Especially after that decisive battle that opened the lands of present-day Turkey. The rise of the church in the Middle Ages. I mean, you can make an entire topic out of this, the whole church fiasco. The church became so powerful and so invested politically that they can even command armies. Now, it's always disheartening when we see Muslims look at our history the same way Western history is observed. They think that because Western Europe had this very corrupt church, that Islam was the same thing. These scholars were corrupt and they had these corrupt institutions. When that simply just wasn't the case. There are many differences. Among the differences is that the church was invested politically and they had access to the military. Therefore, when the church wanted to eradicate or fight against what they would consider to be an innovation, right, something problematic, they would use the military. And what that ended up doing is it broke Christianity into Catholicism, Orthodoxy, and Protestantism. It broke Christianity. Whereas Islam, because the scholars were always an opposition to the political entity, they didn't have access to the military. Therefore, in order to deal with these ideological problems, they had to resort to intellectual discourse and discussion. So how do scholars push back against ideological deviations? Through books, through dialogue, through debate. They don't have access to the military. So you find that Islam, although there are different ideologies, Islam isn't really broken the way Christianity is. So the rise of the church, ambition to consolidate, to spread all over Europe and whatnot. The Fatimid counter-caliph, the Al-Hakim, the Mad Caliph, who we spoke about last week, one of the things he did was he burned down the church of Holy Scepter in Jerusalem. He burnt it down, and this created outrage. The church was rebuilt soon, but the news ignited crusades, possibly grievances against the initial conquest of Islam. Right, they still had that resentment. Other reasons could be that there were a lot of knights. Being a knight was something noble back in the day. So unless you were of royalty or a knight, or there was one other class, like a rich business person, you were screwed in Europe. You were going to live a very poor and terrible life. So people would enter the military to become knights to get that dignity. And then the church finds out, or the area finds out, man, we have a lot of knights and we're fighting between each other. So why don't we go ahead and send these guys to the Muslim world? Right? And that's what the Crusades was. They were literally mobs. Right? They were untrained, unorganized mobs going into the Muslim world. How did they get there? Well, let's talk about that. In 1099, Jerusalem was captured. It was chaos, mass destruction, the killing of people, massacres including Muslims, Jews, and Christians. The Crusades killed Christians in Jerusalem and elsewhere. They also did a lot of damage to the Byzantine Empire, because remember, the eastern part of Europe was the Byzantine Empire. The western part was the Roman part. The western part was collapsed. It was terrible. The economy was lesser. It was less than a depression. It was worse than a depression. So as they were going, they did some damage to the Byzantine Empire. Relative stability after the initial horrors. So although this was a terrible event, the Muslim world wasn't really impacted that much by it, right? So why was it not impacted? Another question is, well, why didn't the Muslims do anything about it? Well, because the areas that the Crusaders took was really irrelevant to the greater Muslim community, right? These were like the outskirts of the Muslim world, the villages, the farmlands, and then Jerusalem, right? So it would be like, for example, to kind of draw the point a little bit closer to our minds, imagine if an entity went and took North and South Dakota. Right? It's North and South Dakota. How many people are there? It's not really a big deal, right? We wouldn't miss much. America wouldn't be impacted much if they lost North and South Dakota. What if they were to have lost New York? I mean, that's a completely different thing. California, Texas, or one of these larger states. So, I mean, the Crusaders took areas that were really empty or not very important to the greater Muslim community. That's not an excuse, but that was just the reality.
Chef, who is living in Jerusalem?
Muslim, Jews, and Christians.
It wasn't significant at that time for the Muslims.
I'm guessing it wasn't that significant. I mean, there were people there, but it wasn't that significant. It wasn't a major city. Right? I mean, Jerusalem, Mecca, Medina, the populations were very low.
And the reason they killed Christians when they came, is it because of the division? They don't see
Perhaps, or they saw them as traitors. How can you live with Muslims? Or they were just vicious people. So if you look at this map, the Crusades, this is where they're originating. So the western part, and they came down through present-day Istanbul, Constantinople, and it's mentioned that, when these mobs are coming, these armies, again, they're not really armies, they're mobs. They're untrained. They're just people going around, and they're disgusting, right? The hygiene is pretty much zero. They're uneducated. They're just mobs. And they're passing by. It said that when they passed by Constantinople, the people looked at them and they were just shocked. Who are these people? Right? And then they just let them through, whatever. And they kept going through this way until they went down south to Jerusalem, right? And the fact of the matter is, they met no resistance. How did they reach Jerusalem? There was simply no resistance. It wasn't until the Seljuks and then later the Mamluks who start posing a challenge to them, and then they eventually throw them out. But how they got there were no Muslim armies, or they were preoccupied with other things, or they were fighting between one another. They did not meet any resistance. And that's the fact of the matter. And that's how they were able to find the success that they found. Jerusalem would eventually be regained by Salah ad-Din in 1187. What's commonly understood is that this marks the end of the Crusades. It wasn't. In fact, there was over another 120 years of Crusades that would continue. The Crusades were completely thrown out of the Muslim world by the Mamluks in 1302. And the Ottomans played a very important role in that, and we'll get to that once we talk about them. So the last Latin kingdom was in 1291, but they were entirely thrown out in 1302. The Crusades they brought back home social habits and practices of Muslims, but not much intellectual heritage. The intellectual heritage that they took from Muslims is most likely coming from Spain. When they took Spain, that's where they took back all this knowledge. But from the Muslims, in this time, they took back certain practices like soap, cotton, and these things. But there are research that suggests that the Crusades, after returning, this is what sparked the Renaissance. What they took back from the Muslim world is what sparked the Renaissance. So why did the Crusades succeed? And we were mentioning this. Within the Seljuks, fragmentation after the initial conquest, what happens with these empires is the following, and we'll see this with the Mongols. You have one individual who is the original leader, the original person of the movement. He goes and takes a lot of land, and he appoints his sons in different areas. You take this area, you take that region, you take that region. Once the head dies, right, these children, they don't choose a successor for the father, rather they take their own land and say, we are independent of one another, right? So you have this fragmentation, often leads to rivalry and internal fighting. The Fatimid and Seljuk rivalry, they were busy with one another, right? The loss of group feeling, and I'll talk about this inshallah in just a second, or solidarity in the ummah. And an example of that is Imam Ghazali. Now, Imam al-Ghazali, rahimahullah ta'ala, a genius and someone we revere and love very much. He contributed so much to Islamic academia and intellectual discourse. And he's living during this time. So he dies 12 years after they take Jerusalem. So Jerusalem was taken in 1099. Imam Ghazali dies in 1111. As far as we know, Imam Ghazali does not mention a single word about Jerusalem in all his writings. We know nothing. Why? Because he was so into intellectual discourse, theology, aqidah that he completely dismissed, or he just didn't find it important to talk about what's going on in Jerusalem. The loss of the group feeling. Next up, that's going on, and then if that's not bad enough, you have the worst event in Islamic history, maybe even worse than what's going on today, and that is the Mongols and the destruction of the Eastern Muslim world. So these previous regimes, they didn't destroy anything; they just took over. They didn't even change the regimes. It said that they were so, the Muslims got so used to the changing of regimes that they actually had a protocol for this. That whenever new people would come, okay, this is what we do, this is how things work, right? May Allah give you tawfiq and bye, right? That's what. It wasn't this mass killing. People weren't being slaughtered left and right. It wasn't complete overhauls of the political government or anything like that. Now, when the Mongols come in, they destroy. They lay siege and destruction to the entire eastern part of the Muslim world. This is their empire at its peak. In 1279, this is their empire. This is massive. And it said it's the second largest empire in human history. And to make things a little bit, put things more into perspective, the top is the Soviet Union, not Russia, the Soviet Union, which includes a lot of areas that have been broken off from Russia ever since. So Kazakhstan and the parts of Europe today, Estonia, Lavitica, and these other areas. So that's the Soviet Union at its peak land mass was almost 23 million kilometers squared. The Mongol Empire was 24 million kilometers squared. It was larger than Russia. Now, as I mentioned just now, the head of state keeps things together, but when he dies, or before he dies, he has all his children in these different areas, and then when he dies, it just falls apart. So Genghis Khan is the one who's initiated this push, right? And then once he dies before he reaches the Muslim world, or at least Baghdad. He already entered these areas. So the Turkic areas, where is this? Khurasan. It said that Khurasan held off the Mongols for 20 years. The Afghanis, in their might. 20 years. And they would have kept them held off if it wasn't for Baghdad, which stopped sending them reinforcements or wealth to continue to fuel their defense. So they were broken. They come this way towards, where's Baghdad? Baghdad is here. So this is the Abbasid Caliphate. So by the time they reach the borders, his grandson, Hulagu, is in power now. And he has all of this, right? And he's not the emperor. The emperor is still back in Mongolia or China, which was his brother. And it's said that Hulagu married a Christian woman, and theories say that it was her who fueled this anti-Islam, or the hate towards Islam and Muslims. So he laid siege to Baghdad. Eventually the caliph surrenders, thinking that they will come to terms, but that doesn't happen. They completely annihilate Baghdad. They destroy it. And from then, so this is around 1252, Baghdad was sacked. From 1252 until now, Baghdad really lost its place. Right? It did not recover ever since then. And then Hulagu started pushing westward towards, he wanted to get to Damascus and then Egypt, but before he reaches Damascus, word comes to him that his brother passed away in China, so he went back. And that marks the end of their expansion in terms of the Muslim world. And then once he dies, all these regions become dynasties, brothers at rivalry with one another. So after that, it's the Ilkhans who become a very big task and hassle for the Muslims. So Ibn Taymiyyah, when he talks about the Mongols, he's talking about these guys. Also, who watches the Ertugrul series, right? Yeah. My guess is that when he fights the Mongols, he's fighting these guys, the Ilkhans. That's my guess, because it was about the same time. Right? And we'll talk more about that, inshallah, once we get there. Yes, do I get tough? Okay, so with time, what happens is they do eventually cause damage to Damascus, um, the Ilkhans, and then they try going to Egypt, but they're stopped in the decisive battle of Ain Jalut, and that marks the end of the Mongols and their their military expansion. Muhammad. Right, so Ain Jalut, which occurs before the time of Ibn Taymiyyah, yeah. So they took pretty much the eastern half of the Muslim world. SubhanAllah. Well, what's interesting about this is that the Mongols, or at least those in the Muslim world, accept Islam. They become Muslim. Why? Because if you remember, I mentioned earlier that these people are coming from these outskirts, lands that weren't a civilization. They don't know what to do once they take over these places. Okay, what do we do now, right? It's not like the Romans who have a civilization. When they enter a place, they become very rooted. It's said that before they pushed back against the Mongols, Rome invaded Alexandria. And the general of the army said, okay, let's go to Alexandria first, free that before we deal with the Mongols. Why? Because his reason was when the Romans come, they root themselves. They become a civilization. And we see this in colonialism, right? They sit and they stay there, right? So they needed to uproot them before they become too rooted. So the Mongols become Muslim, right? Not always the best practicing Muslims. Some were righteous, some weren't righteous, but with time they end up becoming incorporated in the Muslim Ummah. And this is really interesting. And it shows you the power of Islam. And that is, Islam was not only capable of penetrating the hearts of these foreigners, but effectively incorporated them into Islamic civilization. I mean, it's really amazing how that works. And a lot of them become kings, leaders, right? Okay, so that's the Mongols. What time is it? Okay, why don't we stop there? I know I got some advice that don't make it too long, too much information. So let's stop there, and then we can talk about this next week, inshallah, and then we can leave some time for Q&A. Are there any questions? Should I continue? Yeah? Yeah, what's up?
You mentioned that when the Mongols kind of like crossed over to Baghdad, and there was one that married the Christian.
Right.
Then, based on that information itself, you say some of them still are Muslims, or they converted. So I was just kind of like wondering, how does that happen?
So Hulagu was not a Muslim. It was after him. They started becoming Muslim.
Oh, it's after.
So after they destroyed the Muslim world, right? Now they have these areas and they're leading us, okay, well, what the heck do we do now, right? So they say, okay, well, let's check out this Islam. They become Muslims and they start rebuilding what they destroyed. So this was after Hulagu.
I got one question.
Sure.
Remember when you, in the earlier part, you said the Seljuk, when they
Seljuks.
came over and they took over, is it by war or they just ingrain themselves into the society?
So no doubt battle occurred, but it doesn't seem like it was these vicious battles. Right? It's not like they entered a society and wreaked havoc in the society. They just fought an army. Once that army was defeated, they became the power. Right? And they said, okay, you guys go, and we're taking over now. So if anyone died, it was the people in the military and the heads of state. That's it. Any other questions? Continue or stop?
You can continue. I'm fine
Continue?
with it.
Okay, all right, so we'll just go on for maybe 10 more minutes or so. Islamic scholarship. Again, this is the same period. The reason why I bring this up is because it's really interesting what's going on in Islamic scholarship during this time. Despite the fact that it's absolutely chaos during this time, you find that the most popular scholars are coming out of this time. Now, when I started seeking knowledge, and I'm reading these very well-known names, Imam Nawawi, Ibn Taymiyyah, Ghazali, all these guys, Ibn Kathir, Ibn Qayyim, Ash-Shatibi, all these guys are coming from these two generations, or these two centuries. And the question is, well, why? I mean, it's chaos. The Muslim world is on fire. Yet some of the greatest scholars come out of this time. Or at least we should say, scholarship today goes back to these individuals. So if someone is learning about Islam, it's most likely learning about someone who was living in this time, or the books of someone in this time. So what was going on? Why did that happen? Now during this time, one of the things that's happening to scholars is that the role is changing. So if you remember when I talked about the four imams and what scholars were, they were intellectuals, right? They were people who researched and were critically thinking, trying to come to conclusions. What happens is during this time, the role of scholars changes from research to compilation. Scholars become more focused on compiling the knowledge, the libraries that they have, and gathering it in these books. And from socially active to professors. Previously, there were people who were engaged in society. They were part of society. They weren't imam or a scholar for a living. Right? That's not their profession. They were a business person. They were doing something else. And then their knowledge is kind of their hobby, and they succeeded greatly in that. Now, with the madrasas and these schools coming out, the scholars start becoming professors. Where do you find the scholars? You find them in the universities. That's where you go. Where's intellectual Islamic discourse? You got to go to the universities. Right? So it's shifting and changing. And so that occurs with the establishment of madrasas. Scholars begin to develop standardized curriculums for their school of thought. So what happens is the following. The first 6-7 centuries of Muslim scholarship, they have all these books and all this information. These guys come and say, man, they did such a good job. Why don't we do the following? Now that we have schools and institutions, why don't we start compiling these books and standardizing them so that we can develop a curriculum? So when a student enters school or enters these madrasas, we start them off with the basic of this science. And then once they get that basic down, they elevate to the intermediate level and then to the advanced level, to the experts, to scholarship, etc. So what you find that during this time, they start compiling what's called mutun. These books that summarize the past 700 years of information about a particular subject or particular science. So, for example, for the ladies who come to the Tuesday class, we took Aqidah Tahawiyah, remember? So, when is that being written? During this time. Right? They're taking this book and standardizing it. Now, this is a primary book, a crucial book for anyone who wants to be a scholar. You have to read this. If you don't read it, I mean, what are you doing, right? You haven't entered really academia and scholarship. You have to read this book. And you have that for each and every one of the sciences. So when you enter fiqh, for example, right, you start with the basic book, the beginner's book, and then you go to the intermediate book, and then you go to the expert book. And these books become really the source. This is standardized. If you want to be a scholar of the Shafi'i madhab, you have to have these books read and known like the back of your hand. Right? So this was occurring during this time. They were compiling all this information. So scholars become extremely effective in compiling previous work, summarizing it, and presenting it in a memorizable manner. There are pros to this, and that is information becomes organized. When you look at older books, I mean, it's not really organized. It talks about a particular issue, and then further down it talks about the same issue again. And it's just kind of random. And I always wondered why they're doing that, where it was just because they're, as we say, al-barakah, it's okay, don't worry about it, people will figure it out. But later I came to realize that they were doing that because that's how the Quran is. The Quran isn't linear. It's not a storybook or a novel or an essay where it's kind of building on itself. Rather, the Quran talks about one thing here, switches topics, and then 100 pages down it goes back to the first topic. So they were mimicking the style of the Quran. So what they do is they organize information. They development of curriculum so effective it can turn students into scholars. Right? I mean, the power of these mutun, these books that they authored in this time, I mean, it's amazing. It can turn a person into a scholar in very little time, if they have the dedication. They look at these books, okay, start off with this, okay, I learned it, go to the next book, you learned it, the third book, you learned it, now you are a scholar of this science. And you can do that within 2 years, 3 years, right? Not to say that these scholars were more knowledgeable than the previous ones, absolutely not, but they develop something that's so effective it can make students into scholars. A person's level of knowledge becomes easier to test. Right? How do I know so-and-so is a scholar or not? Anyone can pick up a mic and start preaching and give a khutbah. Anyone can do it. And if they're charismatic, mashallah, people, man, that guy's a scholar, right? Well, how do we know that? Look at what they would do. Ibn Daqiq al-Eid, a prominent Shafi'i scholar, he was in Egypt. He was Qadi Qulat. He was the supreme judge of Egypt. Now, the court will you have the supreme judge, and then you have the sheikh of the Malikis, the sheikh of the Hanafis, the sheikh of the Hanabil, and sheikh of the Shafi'is, who are kind of like his advisors. You have a total of 5. The sheikh of the Shafi'is from Damascus comes and visits Cairo, right? And word gets to this group that he's saying that he's more knowledgeable than the sheikh of Cairo, the sheikh of Shafi'i of Cairo, right? So they call him. They said, Sheikh, welcome to our area. We're very happy you're here. We hear that you're saying this and that, right? So we wanna decide who's more knowledgeable, you or the one in Cairo. So he said, okay. They meet and they want to test his knowledge. They want to compare the two, test each's knowledge. So the sheikh of the Shafi'is of Damascus starts saying, Inna alhamdulillah, nahmadu, etc. and stuff. So Ibn Daqiq says, hold on, stop. You think we're going to test you on something you memorized? Open the Quran. Like this. All right, you see this verse? Why is the subject before the predicate? Right? Why did Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala say this and he didn't say that? If he were to have said this, how would that change the meaning? Right? And he started saying, he wasn't able to keep up with Ibn Daqiq al-Eid. But the Sheikh of the Shafi'is of Cairo started saying it's because of this and it's because of that. So in the end, Ibn Daqiq al-Eid tells the Damascus, learn from this guy. Learn from him. So there's a way to test it. If I want to test someone who claims that they are a scholar of fiqh, okay, what fiqh did you study? The Hanbali fiqh. Okay, open this book. What does this mean? What is the opinion here? What is the opinion there? Did you read these books? There's a way of testing this so we can tell who's really a scholar, founded in knowledge versus who isn't. The cons of this is that it minimized critical thinking. And people became more dependent on taqleed. So it's about memorizing this book rather than understanding the principles of fiqh and using your mind, critically thinking, how can I apply this or how should this be applied? Right? So we'll talk more about taqleed once we get to the colonial era, because some people really blame that. Texts are so advanced, it becomes increasingly difficult for laymen to access scholasticism. Right? Unless you are part of this school, right, you're just not going to learn about Islam. Now, I challenge anyone here, any of the Arabic speakers, to open a book of fiqh and tell me what it means. You're not going to know. Right?
It's almost like foreign language.
It's almost like a foreign language. Just like if someone were to open a book of law, like an advanced book of law, or a research about law, you're not going to understand it. Because it's so advanced that you need prior knowledge in order to understand it. Students become more concerned with memorizing information than keeping it up to date. In other words, when you look at some of these books, right? So I studied some of these books, and some of these books will point to issues in fiqh, right? For example, back in the day, at least in desert land, they have, you know how we have those things that we ground spices, for example, right? So they would have something like that. It's larger because they'd have to grind the wheat in order to make dough and bread, right? So they'd have it's 2 parts. You have the bowl, and that's implanted in the earth, so you can't really take it out. And then you have the second part, which you put on top and you spin it and it grinds. Okay? So they mentioned this in books of fiqh. If someone were to sell their home, is that part of the land or not? Or is it independent? Right? So if a person buys a home, this is there. Is that part of the purchase or is that piece excluded from that? Right? Back in the day, that was a very relevant issue. Today, we could care less about that. We don't have this. But you have people today memorizing this information, right? It's not up to date. Does that make sense? Right. Okay, let's stop there then. I want to talk next week, inshallah. I'll begin with Ibn Taymiyyah, rahimahullah ta'ala. Not because I want to focus on his ideology, but I want to focus on his project. And Ibn Taymiyyah, the reason why I want to focus on his project is because he's very much revered in our times today. Most people here have heard of Ibn Taymiyyah. the same way they've heard of Bukhari. So I want to understand why. Ask the question, what makes Ibn Taymiyyah so attractive to people today? We'll stop there, inshallah. Sallallahu alayhi wa Muhammad wa ala alihi wa sahbihi ajma'in. If anyone has any questions, then I'd be more than happy to answer. Yes?
I'm just puzzled how Jerusalem was not very important to any of them.
It wasn't important in terms of the state, not religiously.
Oh,
It wasn't, meaning it wasn't a business hub. It wasn't where there's a lot of money.
I see.
It was a sacred place, right? But it wasn't important to the government for them to really be concerned or affected by it.
Okay, yes.
So that's why you see that the Crusades didn't really impact the Muslim Ummah very much. Aside from the horror stories, it didn't really affect what was going on in the Muslim world.
Got it.
Whereas what the Mongols did, I mean, it really had an impact because they destroyed the capital. And they entered very massive, large cities. Right?
What was the biggest threat or the obstacle in these 2 centuries that you mentioned?
I think the invading forces. But if you want to look at it deeper and say it was the disunity of the Muslims that allowed these invading forces to come in the first place. So the government was collapsing, and it was the challenge of the Khilafah, right? And that really is the challenge of, if you look at our history, the biggest problem or the biggest challenge of our history is the Khilafah itself. I mean, it's very rare that it was stable. There's always some sort of problem going on within the Khilafah. Yes, sir.
So, I'm just curious about, the concept of ijtihad.
Yes.
We call ijtihad. Everybody says, that's what's really lacking in
Mhm.
the Muslim world. And like you explained, that all the scholars and the intellectuals were so busy memorizing these books that were,
Mhm.
distributed and written at the same. Why not put the emphasis on ijtihad versus pure memorization? I mean, that actually is a kind of I feel that may be a problematic situation, is that you just, while memorize, if you have a document that's already written out and a thesis that is already written out, you can always go and refer to it. If there's a question, you can go because it's already there. But ijtihad is something, that new formulation that comes, from your imagination or from putting together existing philosophies, existing ideas, and coming up with a new solution,
Right.
rather than just keep going back to the old. And this,
Sure.
somehow we are stuck in this.
Right. So I mentioned what I just said right now. The term ijtihad is it's very general and it's vague. What kind of ijtihad are we talking about? So you find this in Western Muslim Islamic discourse or Western Muslim discourse. We need to go back to ijtihad. Okay, what kind of ijtihad are you talking about, right? Ijtihad can be as simple as thinking about a very simple fatwa. That's a form. A student learning about Islam is doing ijtihad, right? And it can become so advanced where the person needs to go directly to Quran and Hadith and come up with an opinion, right? So ijtihad has a very large spectrum. Now, what are we talking about here? What kind of ijtihad are we talking about? So that's where the concern comes. And I mentioned the issue of taqleed, right? Ibn Qayyim and a lot of Hanbalis afterwards, I wouldn't say they try and dismiss taqleed the way people today try doing it, but they were concerned with it. And the Hanafis were most invested in taqleed. Until this day, Hanafis, taqleed, it has to be this way, right? Shafi'is and Malikis, a little bit less, but the Hanabila never really bought into this concept of this is the matan, this is what our fiqh says, we have to stick to our madhab, and that's it. The Hanabila have absolutely no problem, right? As far as I'm concerned, from Ibn Taymiyyah and before and after, they have no problem of going outside their madhab. Absolutely none. Why? Because that's really the teaching of Imam Ahmad, rahimahullah ta'ala. And the emphasis there, and just the scholars in general honored that, they stayed with that. So is there an amount of ijtihad that was lost? I'd say yes. Is there an amount of ijtihad that wasn't lost? Yes, right? So it wasn't that I mean, it's a really complicated issue. So the bigger scholars, right, they didn't fall into the cons of taqlid. The lesser scholars, the B tier, probably did, right? And as I mentioned, they started becoming professors. Instead of intellectuals, they're becoming professors. I'm specialized in this. This is who I am, right? And once we talk about Ibn Taymiyyah, I'll talk more about that because it's not that he goes against taqlid. He never mentions anything about taqlid, but he presents a model of how to approach Quran and Sunnah that is really appealing to our time today. Right? And I'll talk about that inshallah next week.
But I think it also goes back to the colonial days with Taqlid, at least in Indo-Pak, the Hanafi Taqlid was propagated by the British as a way of unifying or as a way of applying the law. So it did very little in terms of being able to come up with solutions for the society, rather applying the knowledge that existed.
Right. So, as I mentioned, and that's an issue of it was not updated as it should be. You do have people though who are trying to. So Ibn Abidin, who's a major Hanafi scholar from I think Tunis, where was he? Egypt, right? He was a major Hanafi scholar, and he was living in the height of Egyptian colonialism, right? And he's trying to deal with these things. I mean, he's probably the oldest scholar who talks about insurance, and it's so hard to deal with that because once we talk about colonialism wasn't just invaders coming to the Muslim world. It was invaders coming and completely dismantling the Muslim world and replacing it with something else. Right? So it was very difficult to deal with that. And people like Muhammad Rashid Rida and Ibn Abdo, Muhammad Abdo, they really, who are Azharis, right? They really tackle, or they're very much against this concept of taqlid and say, this is the problem. I may not agree with them entirely, but I understand where they're coming from. Right? There is a lack of updating. If I'm memorizing books that were written 700 years ago, it's important to remember that these scholars, they weren't talking to us. They were talking to people of their time. And we tend to make a mistake when we read their works today. We think that they're talking to us and to all times. Ibn Taymiyyah was talking to his people. Now, of course, there's a lot to gain from what he's saying. But we also have to appreciate that he's talking to his people in his time. He didn't write his books for us to copy-paste what he says, but rather to understand his approach, his project in general, which we'll talk about next week, inshallah. So taqlid can be problematic, but at the same time, it's not as bad as what some people make it to seem. Ijtihad is important, but it needs to be disciplined. It can't just be open ijtihad. Right? Anyone who's an engineer here or in some sort of mathematical profession, there are some equations you cannot solve, right? Because you don't have enough information. Well, in order to do taqlid at the highest level, you need to have all the information or else you can't solve the equation. People today, they don't have that. For someone to say, I'm going to do ijtihad, you can do very wrong ijtihad. You can come out with a very wrong solution or conclusion because you simply don't have all the information. No. Yes?
What exactly happened to the Seljuks during the Mongol era?
So once the previous leader died and it broke down into smaller dynasties and sultanates, they became rivals of one another, and some were killed, some were taken over. The Mamluks pushed back against them, or you can say the Mamluks are kind of a branch of them. They lose that, and then the Ottomans also start pushing onwards and reunite the western part of the Muslim world. Right. So they just lose power. I mean, as I mentioned, the biggest problem I've been seeing in terms of our history, or the biggest challenge, is the challenge of the political government, political structure. It's just so transformative, right? It just century after century, it's changing drastically. Any other questions? I mentioned when the Seljuks end, right? The Mongols, the Crusaders. Yeah, so the Seljuks, they're about 2 centuries. So by 12th century, they were 1100s. Yeah, they fall apart, and then the Mamluks take over, which I'll talk about next week, inshallah. Any other questions? وصلى الله على نبينا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين.